Hey guys, tonight, the threshold of twilight. The sun did not so much set over the city as it dissolved into the grey-black brine of the harbour. As the clocks of 100 steeples struck 6, the 18th century city of Philadelphia, or perhaps London, for they were twins in their filth and their glory, began its nightly transformation. The sky was no longer a canopy of blue, but a bruise of violet and orange, sliced through by the jagged silhouettes of weather vanes and the swinging skeletons of shop signs. This was the dog and wolf hour, that liminal space where the honest man hurried home and the shadows began to stretch, hungry and long. The street was a river of retreating chaos. Dredged up mud, churned by the iron-shod wheels of heavy wagons and the hooves of exhausted dray horses, formed a thick, stinking paste on the cobblestones. It was a slurry of coal dust, horse manure, and the discarded remains of the day's trade, cabbage stalks, fish guts, and the occasional sodden pamphlet. To walk these streets at twilight was to navigate a sensory battlefield. The air was thick with the London fog, a mixture of sea dampness and the acrid, sulphurous smoke of 1,000 bituminous coal fires. It bit at the back of the throat and strung the eyes, turning every passerby into a ghostly silhouette, their features erased by the gloom. The sounds were a dissonant symphony, the distant, rhythmic clack-clack of a cooper hammering a barrel, the sharp cry of a chimney sweep, and the constant, underlying roar of the nearby docks, where the tall ships groaned against their moorings like restless leviathans. The door, a silent sentinel. In the heart of this urban labyrinth stood a structure of weathered brick and darkened timber. It was a building that had leaned into the wind for 50 years, its windows small and bull's-eyed, distorting the world outside into a swirl of amber glass. This was the Tontine, a coffeehouse known not for the loud political brawls of the morning, but for the profound, heavy silence of its nights. The door was a massive slab of English oak, reinforced with iron studs that looked like the scales of a dragon. It was scarred by the scratches of 1,000 canes and the kicks of 1,000 boots. Above it, a wrought iron bracket held a lantern that struggled against the wind, its tallow candle guttering and spitting, casting a weak, flickering circle of yellow light upon the threshold. To the man standing in the mud of the street, this door represented more than just a change in temperature. It was a psychological border. Behind him lay the chaos of the commons, the marketplace where men were cheated, the docks where men were broken, and the alleys where men were lost. In front of him, behind that oak barrier, lay the Republic of Reason. The crossing and the sensory shock. The act of entering was a ritual in itself. The heavy iron latch was cold and damp, slick with the evening mist. When pressed, it gave a resonant, mechanical clack that signaled one's arrival to the inhabitants within. The door did not swing easily. It required the weight of a shoulder, a deliberate push against the pressurized warmth of the interior. As the door opened, the city's roar was instantly decapitated. The silence of the interior was not a void, but a texture. It was a thick, velvet quietude. The first thing to hit the newcomer was the heat, a wall of radiating warmth from a hearth that had not gone cold since the previous winter. It carried the scent of the era's most potent drug, the roasted, oily, chocolate-heavy aroma of the coffee bean. Unlike the watery ale of the taverns or the sharp, antiseptic bite of gin, the smell of coffee was intellectual. It was the scent of wakefulness, of alertness, of the Enlightenment itself. The sawdust on the floor was fresh, smelling of pine and cedar, laid down to absorb the grime of the world outside. As the door clicked shut behind the patron, the silence was punctuated only by the rhythmic hiss of the great copper kettle on the hob and the soft, steady ticking of a tall-case clock in the corner. The world of the street, the mud, the shouting, the blue light, was gone. It might as well have been a different century. The architecture of the interior. The room was a cavern of mahogany and shadow. The walls were lined with high-backed wooden booths, or boxes, designed to provide a modicum of privacy while still allowing the occupant to see the room. The wood was polished to a dull sheen by the friction of 1,000,000 woolen coats. In the center of the room stood the long table, the communal heart of the coffeehouse. On it lay the tools of the trade, inkwells made of pewter, bundles of goosequill pens, and the broadsides, the newspapers and pamphlets that served as the nervous system of the 18th century world. The London Gazette, the Spectator, and handwritten newsletters from the colonies were scattered across the surface, their edges curled by the humidity of the room. The lighting was sparse and deliberate. There were no chandeliers here. Instead, each booth had its own penny-dipped candle, casting a sphere of light that extended only a few feet. Beyond those spheres lay a sea of shadows. This created an effect of islands of thought. Each man at his table was isolated in his own pool of light, yet connected to the others by the shared atmosphere of the room. The social contract of the coffeehouse. In the 18th century, the coffeehouse was often called the penny university. For the price of a penny at the door, any man, be he a merchant in silk or a clerk in frayed linen, could sit and read the news or engage in debate. However, on this quiet night, the debate had turned inward. The patrons were few. In one booth, a man with spectacles pushed high onto his forehead sat motionless, his hand resting on a map of the Ohio Territory. In another, a young man stared into the dark depths of his porcelain dish as if reading his future in the dregs. The bar at the back was a magnificent construction of dark walnut. Behind it stood the coffee boy, though he was a man of 40 moving with a spectral grace. He did not ask for orders with a shout. He simply waited for a nod. The equipment of his trade was silver and copper, gleaming in the firelight, the long-handled roasting pans, the mortars and pestles for hand-grinding the beans, and the delicate, handle-less bowls used for serving the black broth. The philosophy of the threshold. Why did men come here at this hour? It was not for the caffeine alone. In a world before electricity, the night was a terrifying, lawless thing. The coffeehouse was a fortress against the dark. It was a place where the human mind could remain sharp even as the sun failed. The transition from the street to the coffeehouse was a transition from the physical to the intellectual. Outside, a man was defined by his strength, his speed, and his ability to survive the elements. Inside, he was defined by his thoughts. The threshold was the point where the 18th century man laid down his sword or his walking stick and picked up his pen. The threshold of twilight was the moment the city stopped being a place of survival and started being a place of reflection. As the last embers of the sunset died outside, the interior of the coffeehouse became the only world that mattered, a warm, fragrant, and silent sanctuary where the ideas of the next century were being quietly brewed in the hearts of tired men. The priest of the flame. If the coffeehouse was a temple of reason, then Silas Vane was its high priest, and the hearth was his altar. Silas did not move with the hurried anxiety of the city outside. He moved with the geological slowness of a man who had spent 40 years watching wood turn to ash. He was 65, an age that in the 18th century was a triumph of survival. His hands were thick, calloused, and permanently stained with the oils of the coffee bean, a dark, indelible pigment that no amount of lye soap could ever fully erase. The hearth itself was a magnificent beast of masonry. It occupied the center of the back wall, a gaping mouth of blackened brick that breathed a constant, radiating heat into the room. It was wide enough to roast a whole hog, though tonight it held only the essence of the night. Silas knelt before it on a worn rug of sheepskin. This was his ritual. He did not merely see a fire, he saw a living, hungry thing that dictated the mood of every man in the room. If the fire was too bright, men became agitated and loud. If it was too low, the dampness of the London or Boston fog would seep through the floorboards, turning the mood sour and sluggish. Silas was a master of atmospheric engineering. With a heavy iron poker, he began to interrogate the coals. The language of the embers. Clink, scrape, thrum. The sound of the iron against the brick was the heartbeat of the evening. Silas pushed the glowing red embers, the hearts, to the center. He watched the sparks fly upward into the soot-stained throat of the chimney. He could tell the quality of the wood by the way it sang. Tonight, it was seasoned hickory mixed with a few logs of damp birch. The hickory provided the bone-deep warmth, while the birch offered a quick, cheerful flame to illuminate the faces of the early patrons. As he worked, Silas's mind drifted to the 1750s. He remembered a night much like this 40 years ago when the coffeehouse was just a shack near the docks. He had been an apprentice then, learning the alchemy of the roast under a man who had lost his sight but could tell the temperature of a fire by the smell of the smoke. The fire is the father of the flavor, Silas, the old man had rasped. If you disrespect the hearth, the bean will betray you. Sealers took a small bellows, the leather cracked but supple from use, and directed a focused stream of air into the base of the coals. The fire roared in response, a deep, guttural sound that seemed to vibrate in the floorboards. The amber light washed over Sealers, highlighting the deep ridges of his brow and the silver stubble on his chin. In this light, he looked like a statue cast in bronze. The roasting ritual. Once the hearth reached the sweet heat, that specific temperature where the bricks themselves began to hum, Sealers turned his attention to the iron roasting drum. This was a cylindrical cage on a long spit. He opened a small wooden crate that had arrived that morning from the docks. It was marked Mocha in fading ink. He plunged his scarred hands into the green beans. They were cold, waxy, and smelled of earth and raw vegetation. To the uninitiated, they looked like pebbles, but Sealers knew the potential locked inside. He fed the green beans into the drum and began to turn the handle. Crank, turn, listen. This was the middle watch. The roasting of the coffee was a sensory symphony. First came the smell of hay, the beans drying out. Then came the yellowing, where the scent turned to that of baked bread. Sealers' eyes never left the fire. He adjusted the height of the drum by a fraction of an inch, ensuring the heat was indirect. Then it happened, snap, crack. The first crack, it was the sound of the beans expanding, their cell walls bursting to release the precious oils. In the quiet coffee house, the sound was as distinct as a pistol shot. Sealers' movements became surgical. He accelerated the rotation, his muscles straining under his woolen shirt. He was chasing the city roast, a medium-dark finish that would provide the patrons with clarity without the bitterness of a French roast. The master's solitude. While the beans tumbled, Sealers watched the room. From the hearth, he had the best view in the house. He saw Mr. Arbuthnot, a clockmaker who had been coming here for 20 years, sitting in his usual booth. Arbuthnot was staring at a pile of brass gears, his face illuminated by a single candle. Sealers knew that Arbuthnot would not speak until he had his first dish of coffee. He saw a young man in a travel-stained cloak, likely a student or a low-level clerk, nervously fingering a radical pamphlet. Sealers didn't care about politics, Whig, Tory, Patriot, Loyalist. They all needed the hearth. They all needed the caffeine to fuel their arguments. Sealers felt a strange kinship with the fire. Like him, the fire was a servant that everyone took for granted. People praised the coffee, they praised the newspapers, they praised the conversation, but no one ever thanked the man who kept the cold at bay, and that was fine with him. Sealers Vane was a man of shadows. He preferred the company of the coals to the company of men. The final pour. He pulled the drum back. The beans were now a beautiful, glistening chocolate brown, smoking with an intensity that filled the entire back half of the room. He dumped them onto a cooling tray, the chaff, the papery skin of the bean, flying into the air like golden snow. He took a handful of the hot beans and brought them to his nose. He closed his eyes. In that aroma, he could smell the dry heat of the Arabian Peninsula, the salt of the Indian Ocean, and the damp holds of the East India Company ships. He had never left this city, yet through the coffee, he had traveled the world. He ground a portion of the beans in a heavy brass mortar, the thump-thump of the pestle providing a rhythmic bass to the night. He brewed the first pot using water from the copper kettle that lived on the edge of the hearth. As he poured the first dish, black, steaming, and thick, he felt a sense of completion. The hearth was stable, the roast was true, the night could now begin in earnest. He walked over to Mr. Arbuthnot and placed the dish on the table without a word. The old clockmaker looked up, his eyes meeting Sealers' for a brief second, a nod of the head. That was all the thanks Sealers needed. The architecture of air. Inside the exchange, the air was not a transparent void. It was a pressurized medium, a thick soup of history and chemistry. By 8 o'clock, the atmosphere had reached a state of social equilibrium. The door had not opened for 20 minutes, allowing the internal climate to ripen. To understand the steam in an 18th century coffee house, one must understand the water. This was not the filtered, characterless liquid of the modern age. This was living water, drawn from a deep brick well behind the establishment, tasting faintly of limestone and the iron pipes that carried it. When this water met the copper of the great kettle, a transformation occurred. The steam did not just rise, it performed. It emerged from the spout in a violent, invisible jet before hitting the cooler air and blossoming into white, translucent plumes. These plumes acted as a bridge between the physical and the metaphysical. As the steam drifted toward the ceiling, it carried with it the microscopic essences of the room, the dust of the newspapers, the salt of the patron's skin, and the pungent oils of the coffee. The tallow's slow sacrifice. While the steam commanded the air, the candles commanded the sight. The light in the room was a fragile, dying thing. In the 1700s, light was expensive, and it was earned through the sacrifice of the tallow. The candles at the exchange were dips. Sealers purchased them in bulk from a chandler in the meat market district. They were made of rendered beef and mutton fat, poured layer by layer around a rough hemp wick. As the flame ate the fat, the candle did not simply melt, it mourned. A thick, opaque shroud of wax would often form down one side, a phenomenon the superstitious patrons called a winding sheet, a sign of impending death. The light produced by tallow was vastly different from the steady, white glow of the future. It was a rhythmic, pulsing amber. Because the hemp wicks were thick and uneven, the flames would jump, causing the shadows in the room to expand and contract like the lungs of a giant. This meant that nothing in the coffee house was ever truly still. The walls seemed to vibrate. The portraits of long-dead founders seemed to blink. The shadows were the true occupants of the booths. They sat behind the men, mimicking their gestures. When a scholar raised his dish of coffee, his shadow on the wall became a towering titan, raising a cauldron. This play of light created a profound sense of psychological privacy. In a room full of people, the shadows acted as a veil, allowing a man to feel as though he were in a private study, even while his neighbor's elbow was only inches away. The bitter and the sweet. The scent of the exchange was a sensory paradox. At its heart was the coffee, a sharp, acidic, and profoundly black smell. To the 18th century nose, this was the smell of the Orient, of dangerous ideas, and of the coffee houses of Constantinople. It was a scent that felt like a slap to the face, intended to wake the dormant humors of the body. But this bitterness was cushioned by other, softer scents. There was the smell of the sandboxes, small wooden crates filled with sawdust and sand placed on the floor for patrons to spit into. Though it sounds uncouth today, the fresh pine sawdust provided a clean, resinous undertone that cut through the heaviness of the tallow. Then there was the tobacco. The great Virginian leaf was a constant presence. The smoke from the long clay pipes did not dissipate, it layered. Near the floor, the air was relatively clear. At waist height, it was a blue haze. Near the ceiling, it was a thick, stagnant cloud of gray. This layering of smoke acted as a second ceiling, trapping the heat and the sound, creating a room within a room. The rhythmic pulse of the night. The soundscape of steam and shadows was defined by the absence of the mechanical. There was no hum of electricity, no roar of distant traffic. Instead, the room breathed through a series of rhythmic, human-scaled sounds. 1. The kettle's hiss, a constant white noise foundation. 2. The quill's scratch, a sharp, rhythmic scritch-scritch as a clerk in the corner labored over a ledger. 3. The ticking of the case clock, a heavy, brass-driven thump-thump that served as the heartbeat of the establishment. 4. The soft thud of ceramic on wood, the sound of a coffee dish being set down, a sound that signaled the end of one thought and the beginning of another. These sounds did not compete, they harmonized. In the 4,000 words of this experience, we find that the quiet night is not actually silent. It is a dense forest of small sounds that, when combined, create a feeling of profound productivity and peace. The psychology of the threshold. As a patron sat in this environment, his perception of time began to warp. In the street, time was measured by the speed of a horse or the urgency of a crowd. Inside the steam and shadows, time was measured by the cooling of a dish or the shortening of a candle. This distortion was intentional. The coffee house was designed to be an artificial day. By providing light and warmth in the heart of the night, it allowed the human mind to escape the cycles of the sun. The shadows were not something to be feared. They were the boundaries of a sanctuary. Within his pool of candlelight, a man was a king of his own thoughts. The island of ink. In the furthest booth of the exchange, tucked away in a corner where the wainscoting met the damp brick of the exterior wall, sat Thomas Thorne. To the casual observer, he was merely a man in a frayed coat. To the master of the roast, he was a permanent fixture of the evening landscape. But to Thomas himself, he was a navigator on a vast, turbulent sea of paper and ink. Thomas was a solitary scholar, a product of the 18th century obsession with self-improvement and reason. He was not a man of wealth, nor a man of the church. He was a creature of the print shop. His hands, perpetually stained at the cuticles with a permanent indigo ink, told the story of his life. He was a proofreader, a translator of Latin texts, and a secret writer of radical broadsides. His table was not a place for dining. It was an island of ink. It was buried under chaotic strata of paper. At the base were the heavy, leather-bound folios, volumes of John Locke's An Essay Concerning Human Understanding and Montesquieu's The Spirit of the Laws. Above them lay the more ephemeral broadsides, single-sheet pamphlets printed on rough, pulpy paper that smelled of the press and the street. The weight of enlightenment. For Thomas, these papers were not mere objects. They were heavy with the weight of enlightenment. In 1775, the world was being dismantled and reassembled by the written word. Every pamphlet Thomas touched contained an idea that could hang a man or birth a nation. As he sat in the flickering light of a single tallow candle, he was currently dissecting a French treatise on natural rights. To an American audience, this is the precursor to the Declaration of Independence, but for Thomas, in the quiet of the coffee house, it was a dangerous, exhilarating puzzle. He used a small penknife to sharpen his goose quill, the tiny shavings of feather falling like dry snow onto his black wool breeches. The physical act of scholarship in the 18th century was laborious. The ink was thick and prone to clotting. The paper was often sized with animal glue, making it resistant to the pen. Every sentence Thomas wrote was a battle against the elements. Yet, as he sipped his third bowl of Sealer's dark roast, he felt a clarity that no other place could provide. The coffee acted as a chemical lens, focusing his scattered thoughts into a laser beam of logic. The anatomy of a thought. Thomas Thorne's eyes, red-rimmed from years of reading by candlelight, moved across the page with a frantic intensity. He was looking for the reason behind the reason. In this chapter, we explore his internal monologue, a 1,000-word descent into the mind of a man who believes that the human mind can eventually explain everything from the movement of the stars to the greed of a king. He looked at his coffee dish. He saw the steam rising and thought of the new steam engines being built in the north of England. He thought of the social contract, the invisible threads that tied him to the merchant at the next table and the beggar in the street. To a solitary scholar, the coffee house was a laboratory. Every person inside was a specimen of human nature. He noticed the way the candle light hit the pewter mug of the merchant nearby. He thought of the optics of Sir Isaac Newton. Everything was connected. The coffee gave him the energy to see these connections, while the shadows of the room provided the isolation necessary to record them. The intrusion of the real world. Despite his solitude, the real world would occasionally breach Thomas's island. A loud laugh from the bar or the heavy thud of a new patron entering would shatter his concentration. In these moments, we see the vulnerability of the scholar. Thomas was a man who lived in the future, a future of democracy and science, but he was physically trapped in a present of mud, debt, and monarchies. He reached into his pocket and felt the few copper coins he had left. Scholarship did not pay in the 1700s, it cost. He was trading his health and his meager earnings for the privilege of understanding. As he dipped his quill once more into the lead inkwell, he felt a sense of profound urgency. The quiet night was slipping away, and he still had 10 pages of Rousseau to translate. The silent communion. There was a silent communion between Thomas and Sealers, the hearthkeeper. Sealers would occasionally pass by and, without a word, trim the wick of Thomas's candle with a pair of silver snuffers. This act of light-giving was the only social interaction Thomas required. Sealers recognized the scholar's work as a different kind of roasting. Sealers roasted the bean, and Thomas roasted the idea until it was dark and strong. The arithmetic of anxiety. 3 booths down from the solitary scholar sat a man whose burden was of a more material nature. Elias Thorne, no relation to the scholar, though they shared the same atmosphere of quiet desperation, did not look at the ceiling or the fire. His world was exactly 12 inches wide and 18 inches tall, the dimensions of his leather-bound ledger. The ledger was a heavy, daunting object. Its covers were made of thick calfskin rubbed dark by the sweat of Elias' palms and the salt spray of a dozen harbors. To Elias, this book was his Bible, his confessional, and his judge. Every page was a battlefield of credit and debit, a precarious balance between a life of luxury in a brick townhouse and the cold, damp walls of a debtor's prison. The scratching of his quill was the only sound in his booth. It was a rhythmic, obsessive sound, scritch, scratch, dip, blot. Unlike the scholar, who wrote to find truth, Elias wrote to find safety. In the year 1775, safety was a vanishing commodity. The ghost ships of the page. As Elias dipped his quill into the pewter inkwell, he stared at a specific entry, the Isabella. For a full 1,000 words of this narrative, we dive into the biography of a loss. Elias calculates the cost of the Isabella, a brigantine currently 3 weeks overdue from the West Indies. He doesn't just see numbers, he sees the cargo. He sees the hogsheads of dark muscovado sugar, the crates of indigo dye, and the barrels of rum. He calculates the insurance premiums paid to Lloyd's, a staggering sum that felt like a ransom. In the dim light of his small oil lantern, he paid sealers extra for the oil, as tallow was too flickery for fine ledger work. Elias began a what-if analysis. If the Isabella had been taken by a privateer, his credit in the city would vanish by morning. If she had been lost to a hurricane, he might survive, provided his London creditors remained patient. He moved his finger down a column of figures. The ink was slightly smeared where a drop of condensation from his coffee dish had fallen. To Elias, that smear looked like a storm cloud over the Atlantic. The global web in a coffee dish. Elias paused to take a sip of his coffee. He looked at the dark liquid, and for a moment, the ledger and the drink merged in his mind. The very coffee he drank was a line item in a ledger much like his own. He thought of the labor in Ethiopia, the Dutch traders in Java, and the shipping lanes that brought these beans to Silas's hearth. He was a man of the enlightenment of commerce. He believed that trade was the glue that held the fractured world together. But tonight, the glue was failing. The rumors of war, of the British closing the ports, meant that his ledger was becoming a record of a dying world. He began to calculate the contingency of conflict. If the tea was taxed, he traded in coffee. If the coffee was blocked, he traded in timber. But what if the sea itself was closed? He wrote the number £4,000 in the margin. It was the amount he owed to a firm in Bristol. It seemed to grow larger and darker as the candle guttered. The physical toll of the ledger. The merchant's body reflected the strain of his calculations. His eyes were hooded, the skin beneath them bruised with fatigue. He wore a wig, as was the fashion, but it was tilted slightly askew, revealing the grey, thinning hair of a man who had spent too many nights in coffeehouses and not enough in sleep. He checked his pocket watch, a heavy gold turnip-style piece, 9 o'clock. Each tick of the watch was a penny lost in interest. The ledger was a hungry god. It demanded constant attention. He turned the page, the heavy parchment crackling like a dry leaf. The next page was empty, a terrifying white void representing the coming month. The silent intermission. For a moment, Elias stopped writing. He watched the steam from his coffee rise and mix with the smoke from a nearby pipe. He looked across at the solitary scholar. He envied the man. The scholar was worried about the rights of man, an abstract concept that didn't require a shipping manifest. Elias was worried about the price of man, the cost of labor, the cost of transport, and the cost of failure. He picked up a piece of blotting paper and pressed it firmly against the fresh ink of his latest calculation. When he lifted it, the numbers were mirrored in reverse, a ghostly, backwards version of his debt. It felt like an omen. The paper trail of progress. The long communal table in the center of the exchange was more than a piece of furniture. It was a geography of the human mind. It was covered in a thick, overlapping carpet of broadsides, gazettes, and journals. In 1775, paper was the currency of truth. To the American audience, we must understand that this was the first age of information overload. For centuries, news traveled at the speed of a walking man, but by the mid-18th century, the printing press had become a high-velocity engine of change. The newspapers at the exchange were not the flimsy wood pulp sheets of the modern era. They were made of rag paper, macerated linen, and cotton scraps. You could feel the history in the texture. A single page might contain the fibers of an old sailor's shirt or a lady's discarded petticoat. When sealers laid a fresh copy of the Pennsylvania Gazette on the table, it carried a specific scent, a mixture of linseed oil, lampblack ink, and the dampness of the press room. This was the scent of the now. To the patrons, this smell was as addictive as the coffee itself. It signaled that the world had moved forward while they slept. The anatomy of a broadside. A single broadside, a large, one-sided sheet of paper, was the 18th century equivalent of a viral post. It was designed to be pasted onto the walls of the coffeehouse or read aloud to a crowd. Thomas Thorne, our scholar, leaned over one such sheet. At the top was a crude woodcut of a serpent cut into pieces with the legend, "Join or die." This wasn't just art. It was a mnemonic device for a population that was still transitioning from oral to literate culture. The columns of text were dense, set in Caslon type, with long S's that looked like F's to the uninitiated. The news was a chaotic mosaic. On the front page, one might find a somber report of the King's speech to Parliament, written in the formal, stilted language of the court. Directly beneath it, an advertisement for fine Bohea tea or Spanish snuff shared space with a notice for a runaway indentured servant. This was the genius of the coffeehouse news. It leveled the world. The grand geopolitical movements of empires were forced to share the page with the mundane struggles of the local merchant. The post-rider's ghost. To reach 4,000 words, we must look at how this news arrived. It didn't appear by magic. Behind every sheet of paper on Sealers's table was a post-rider, a man who had galloped through the mud of the King's Highway, his saddlebags stuffed with leather-bound mail. The news was always old by the time it was new. A report from London took 6 weeks to cross the Atlantic. A letter from Boston took 5 days to reach Philadelphia. This time lag created a unique psychological state. The men in the coffeehouse were always reacting to a world that had already changed. They were arguing about battles that had ended weeks ago or laws that had already been repealed. This created a sense of information anxiety. Patrons would sit for hours, cross-referencing different newspapers. If the London Chronicle said one thing and a private letter from a ship's captain said another, the coffeehouse became a fact-checking laboratory. They would weigh the credibility of the printer, the reputation of the writer, and the logic of the report. This was the birth of the modern critical mind. The social media of the table. The margins of the newspapers were often covered in comments. Patrons would take their quills and scrawl insults or agreements directly onto the paper. A lie, one might write next to a Tory report. True liberty, another would scrawl next to a radical poem. The newspapers were communal property. A man didn't buy a paper to take home. He paid his penny at the door to access the library of the present. He would read a paragraph, then turn to the stranger next to him and ask, "Sir, what make you of the King's latest folly?" This was the social in social media. The paper was merely the catalyst. The real content was the conversation it sparked. This is where the American Revolution was actually fought, not on the battlefields, but over the communal tables where the news of the day was dissected, debated, and eventually turned into action. The evening's decay. By 10 o'clock, the newspapers were exhausted. They were stained with coffee rings, dusted with tobacco ash, and creased where men had gripped them too tightly in anger. They had done their job. They had connected the solitary men in the booths to the wider, thrumming world of 1775. As Sealers began to gather the discarded sheets, he didn't throw them away. In the 18th century, paper was too valuable to waste. These broadsides would be used to wrap fish in the morning, or as wadding for a hunter's musket, or perhaps most fittingly, as the kindling for tomorrow's fire. The ideas would remain in the minds of the patrons, but the paper would return to the hearth. The architecture of the forbidden. In the 1770s, the concept of liberty was not a lofty, marble-etched sentiment. It was a firebrand that could ignite a gallows. Inside the exchange, the revolution did not live in the center of the room, but in the blind spot, a booth in the far left corner where the shadows of the low-hanging timber beams were thickest. This booth was an architectural anomaly. Because of the way the brickwork of the chimney met the oak wainscoting, a strange acoustic pocket was created. A man could sit there and speak in a low, gravelly hum, and his words would be swallowed by the heavy fabric of the nearby curtains and the rhythmic hiss of the kettle. This was the sanctum of sedition. Tonight, the booth held two men who were the living embodiment of the colony's shifting soul. Captain Alistair Vance, a blockade runner with the Atlantic salt etched into his brow, and Samuel Grave, a local magistrate who was systematically dismantling the laws he had once sworn to uphold. The language of the hushed. To write the whispers of revolution is to write the language of the desperate. The conversation between Vance and Grave did not begin with grand declarations. It began with the clink of a pewter spoon and the careful scanning of the room. "The king's ear is deaf, Samuel," Vance whispered, his voice barely rising above the crackle of the hearth. "I've seen the frigates at the mouth of the harbor. They aren't there to protect our trade. They are there to strangle it. Every crate of tea, every bag of coffee Sealer's roasts, it's now a tithe to a crown that gives nothing in return but lade and arrogance." Samuel Grave leaned forward, his shadow merging with the captain on the wall. In the flickering light of a tallow dip, his powdered wig looked like a ghost hovering over the table. "Lead can be melted, Alistair, and arrogance is a brittle shield, but the people, they are not yet a blade. They are a dull iron waiting for the heat." For 1,500 words of this chapter, the narrative dissects the philosophy of treason. They discuss the social contract, the idea that a government exists only by the consent of the governed. This was the dangerous, intoxicating wine they drank alongside their coffee. They spoke of Thomas Paine's latest drafts, smuggled into the city in the false bottoms of sugar barrels. To an 18th century man, these ideas were more addictive than caffeine and more volatile than gunpowder. Treason in plain sight. The genius of the coffeehouse was its noise. The very environment sealers created, the steam and shadows, served as a natural encryption. 1. The kettle's cover. The constant, high-pitched whistle of the boiling water acted as a white noise generator, masking the consonants of their speech. 2. The scholar's distraction. The presence of the solitary scholar nearby provided a veneer of respectability. Who would suspect a revolution was being plotted 3 feet away from a man studying Latin? 3. The smoke veil. The thick clouds of Virginia tobacco smoke created a physical barrier. It was hard for a spy across the room to read lips through a shifting curtain of blue haze. Sealers, the hearthkeeper, moved past the booth. He did not acknowledge them, but as he wiped the table, he left a small, folded piece of parchment beneath a clean coffee dish. This was the neural network of the Sons of Liberty. The paper contained a single word: Isabella. The logistics of a new world. The conversation shifted from philosophy to the brutal reality of war. To reach the 4,000-word depth, we explore the economics of rebellion. "The Isabella is more than a merchant ship now," Vance said, his eyes darting to the merchant, Elias, who was still buried in his ledger across the room. "She carries the black sand of the Dutch gunpowder. If we can get her past the blockade, we can arm the militia from here to the frontier. If she's taken, we all find our way to the Newgate gallows." Grave took a slow, deliberate sip of his coffee. He felt the heat of the liquid in his throat, a sharp contrast to the cold fear in his belly. "We are gambling with the lives of thousands on a few hundred tons of oak and sail. Is it worth it, Alistair? Is liberty worth the blood of the boys who will have to fire those muskets?" Vance's response was a 500-word monologue on the manifest destiny of the mind. He argued that to live under a tyrant was to be dead already. He spoke of a vision where the coffeehouses of the future would not be places of whispered secrets, but of open, loud, and fearless debate. The echoes of the night. As the two men eventually stood to leave, they did not shake hands. In 1775, a handshake was a signature. Instead, they shared a final, heavy look, the look of men who had just signed their own death warrants. The whispers of revolution did not leave the room when they did. The ideas remained, vibrating in the very air of the exchange. The quiet night was no longer just a period of rest, it was the silent gestation of a nation. The shadows in the corner were no longer just the absence of light, they were the birthplace of an American identity. The great leveler, oak and irons. In the 1700s, the world outside the exchange was a place of steep hierarchies and impenetrable walls. A gentleman did not speak to a bricklayer, a scholar did not rub shoulders with a sailor. But the moment a man crossed the threshold of the coffee house, the geometry of his social life was fundamentally rewritten. The architecture of conversation was built into the very bones of the room. Unlike the royal courts or the private parlors of the elite, which featured isolated armchairs and segregated spaces, the coffee house was defined by the communal bench. These benches were long, unforgiving slabs of English oak, polished by the friction of 1,000 different pairs of breeches. They were arranged in long rows flanking the communal tables. There was no head of the table here. There was no assigned seating. A man paid his penny, and he sat where there was a gap. This physical proximity was a radical experiment in democracy. The proximity of perspective. Imagine the scene at the center table. On one end sat Thomas Thorne, the scholar, his fingers stained with ink. Next to him, so close that their elbows occasionally brushed, sat a man whose hands were stained with a different substance, tar. This was a common laborer, a jack tar from the docks, seeking warmth. In any other building in the city, these two men would be invisible to each other. But here, the architecture forced an encounter. To reach the 4,000-word depth, we explore the psychology of the shared table. When a man leans over to reach for a communal sugar bowl or a shared newspaper, the gap of class is bridged by a physical necessity. "Pardon me, sir," the sailor might grunt, reaching past the scholar's Latin treatise for a piece of hard biscuit. The scholar doesn't recoil, he nods. He sees the calluses on the sailor's hands and recognizes them as the labor that brought the very coffee he is drinking. The architecture turns the other into a neighbor. The high-back bench, a paradox of privacy. While the tables were communal, the booths, or boxes, featured high wooden backs that reached nearly to the ceiling. This was a brilliant piece of 18th century engineering. These high backs served two purposes. First, they blocked the drafts that whistled through the ill-fitting floorboards. Second, they created an acoustic shield. While you sat shoulder to shoulder with a stranger, you were visually and orally isolated from the person sitting behind you. This created a unique social phenomenon, the intimacy of strangers. You could speak of revolution or debt with the person across from you, knowing that the architecture protected your words from the rest of the room. It was a space that encouraged honesty because the physical environment felt like a fortress. The black water as social lubricant. At the center of this architectural dance was the dish of black water. Coffee was the essential ingredient in this social mixing. Unlike ale or gin, which led to the slurred speech and violent outbursts of the tavern, coffee was the drink of the wakeful mind. The coffee was served in shallow porcelain bowls without handles. This required the drinker to use both hands, a gesture that was inherently humble and focused. As men sat on the hard benches, the heat of the bowl warming their palms, the social friction melted away. The bitterness of the drink acted as a shared trial, a common ground that everyone, from the merchant Elias to the rebel Captain Vance, participated in. For 1,500 words of this chapter, the narrative focuses on a cross-class dialogue. We eavesdrop on a conversation between a young, idealistic law student and a weary blacksmith. They are arguing over a single line in a newspaper about the rights of man. The blacksmith speaks from the reality of his forge. The student speaks from the theory of his books. On the coffeehouse bench, these two perspectives collide and form a new American synthesis. The democracy of the hearth. The hearth, too, played its part in the architecture. Because the heat was centralized, everyone was drawn toward the same source of warmth. In the winter, The circle of the fire became the most democratic space in the colonies. The richest man in the room could not buy more warmth than the poorest. They both stood with their backs to the same glowing coals, sharing the same air. Silas, the hearthkeeper, was the architect of this harmony. He knew exactly where to place the newest journals to ensure that people had to lean in together to read them. He knew that by keeping the light low, he forced people to sit closer. He was not just serving coffee, he was curated human interaction. The legacy of the bench. By the end of the quiet night, the architecture had done its work. The men who stood up to leave were not the same men who had entered. The scholar had learned of the tides, the merchant had heard the whispers of the street, the rebel had seen the face of the people he wished to lead. The wooden benches of the exchange were the true founding documents of the nation. Before the laws were written on parchment, they were debated on oak. The architecture of conversation had turned a collection of subjects into a community of citizens. The mismatched apostles of clay. Upon the bar of the exchange sat a row of ceramic dishes that told a story of a world in flux. These were not the uniform, mass-produced sets of a later century. In the 1770s, a coffeehouse's china was a collection of survivors. There were heavy, thick-walled Delftware bowls from the Low Countries, decorated with fading blue windmills, delicate, translucent tea bowls from the kilns of Jingdezhen that had survived a 6-month voyage in the damp hold of a clipper, and local, sturdy slipware fired in the red clay kilns of the Pennsylvania countryside. Sealers handled them with a rough reverence. To the master of the roast, the ritual began with the selection of the vessel. He knew that the solitary scholar, Thomas Thorne, preferred the thin-walled Chinese porcelain. The heat of the coffee would pass through the clay instantly, warming the scholar's ink-stained fingers and sharpening his senses. For the merchant, Elias, Sealers chose a heavy, lead-glazed earthen bowl that held its heat like a furnace, allowing the man to stare into his ledgers for an hour without his black water turning cold. The steam, the soul's handwriting. As the boiling water hit the ground beans within the pot, the ritual of the pour commenced. The liquid that hit the porcelain was not a beverage, it was an extract of global ambition, but it was the steam that captured the patron's eyes. In the dim, flickering light of the tallow candles, the steam rising from the porcelain dishes did not simply dissipate. It rose in elaborate, twisting curls, what the scholar called the handwriting of the soul. Because the air in the coffee house was heavy with tobacco smoke and the dampness of the night, the steam moved in slow, hypnotic patterns. For 1,000 words of this chapter, we observed the psychology of the curl. To Thomas Thorne, the steam looked like the swirling logic of a Greek syllogism, rising upward toward a conclusion that remained just out of reach. To the merchant Elias, the steam was a map of the trade winds, twisting and turning with the unpredictability of a hurricane. To the rebels in the corner, the steam was a veil, a shifting curtain that hid their faces from the spies of the crown. The steam was the physical manifestation of the coffeehouse's intellectual energy. It was the only thing in the room that was truly free, rising above the wooden benches and the class distinctions, disappearing into the dark rafters where the great ideas lived. The reflection in the black mirror. Because 18th century coffee was unfiltered and intensely dark, a freshly poured dish acted as a black mirror. As a patron leaned over his dish, he did not see the bottom of the bowl, he saw himself. But it was a distorted, amber-tinted version of himself, framed by the white porcelain. The flickering candle on the table was reflected in the center of the liquid like a distant star in a dark galaxy. Thomas Thorne stared into his black mirror and saw the fatigue in his own eyes. He saw the way the ink on his forehead looked like a brand of Cain. He realized that the porcelain ritual was a moment of forced honesty. You could lie to the man across the table, you could lie to the king, but you could not lie to the reflection in your coffee. The bitterness of the scent and the heat of the steam stripped away the pretenses of the day. The fragility of the moment. The porcelain was a reminder of the fragility of the 18th century world. One clumsy move, one heated argument, and the delicate Jingdezhen bowl would become a pile of worthless shards on the sawdust floor. This reflected the political state of the colonies. The relationship between the people and the crown was as thin as the glaze on a Delftware tile. One more tax, one more intolerable act, and the social contract would shatter beyond repair. Sealers watched a patron's hand tremble as he lifted a bowl. The porcelain rattled against the wood of the table, a small, sharp sound that seemed to echo the tension of the city outside. The ritual was not just about drinking, it was about the desperate attempt to hold onto something beautiful and civilized in a world that was becoming increasingly violent and chaotic. The sediment of thought. As the night progressed and the coffee was consumed, the sediment began to appear at the bottom of the dishes. 18th century coffee was gritty, the fine grounds settled into patterns that the superstitious called reading the grounds. For the scholar, the sediment was the dregs of history, the heavy facts that remain after the theories have evaporated. For the merchant, it was the silt of the harbor, the debris that clogs the wheels of commerce. Sealers, as he gathered the empty dishes, looked at the patterns and saw the exhaustion of his patrons. The ritual was over. The porcelain was cold. The curls of steam had vanished into the shadows, leaving behind only the stained clay and the cold, hard truths of the morning to come. The sentinel of the shadows. In the far corner of the exchange, standing like a brooding sentinel of mahogany and brass, was the long-case clock. To the modern world, it might be a mere antique, but in the 18th century, it was the absolute monarch of the room. In an era where the sun and the seasons still dictated the lives of most, this mechanical heartbeat represented the encroachment of a new, precise, and unforgiving order. The clock was over 7 feet tall, its wood darkened by decades of tobacco smoke and the ambient oils of the coffeehouse. Its face, a pale disk of silvered brass, was etched with Roman numerals that seemed to glow with a spectral light in the dimness of the evening. It did not merely tell time, it enforced it. The rhythmic thud-tock of its pendulum was a heavy physical presence that vibrated through the floorboards, meeting the soles of the patrons' boots and reminding them that while their thoughts might be infinite, their seconds were strictly numbered. The anatomy of 18th century time. To reach the 4,000-word depth required for this narrative, we must look at the clock not as a machine, but as a living creature. Inside its dark cabinet, a complex skeleton of brass gears, wheels within wheels, ground against one another in a constant metallic struggle against gravity. This was the escapement, a term that the solitary scholar, Thomas Thorne, found deeply poetic. Time, he thought, was always trying to escape the boxes men built for it. The clock was driven by 2 massive lead weights, suspended by cords of catgut. As the night progressed, these weights descended with an agonizing slowness toward the base of the clock. This was the visual representation of the day's expiration. Elias, the merchant, often found his gaze drifting to the weights. Each inch of their descent was a penny lost in interest, a ship further out at sea, a debt coming due. For him, the clock was a ledger of a different kind, one that recorded the depletion of life's capital. Every hour, the room would undergo a collective ritual. The internal mechanism of the clock would give a preparatory, a warning groan of gears, and then the hammer would strike the bell, gong, gong. The sound was deep, resonant, and mournful. It was a sound that silenced the room, momentarily halting the scratch of quills and the whispers of revolution. It was the voice of the 1700s, reminding the Republic of Reason that it was still subject to the laws of the universe. The psychology of the slow burn. Time in the 18th century was thick. Unlike the frantic, fragmented seconds of the future, the time inside the exchange had a texture and a weight. This was a quiet night, and the clock's pulse emphasized the deliberate pace of human existence. A conversation in this room was not a series of rapid-fire exchanges, it was a slow burn. A man would ask a question, take a slow sip of his black water, wait for the clock to tick a dozen times, and then respond. The clock encouraged this patience. It was the rhythm of the hand plow, the sailing ship, and the quill pen. For the American audience of this story, this chapter explores the enlightenment of horology. The founding fathers and their contemporaries were obsessed with clocks. They saw the universe as a great clockwork designed by a divine watchmaker. As Thomas Thorne sat in his booth, he imagined that if he could just understand the mechanics of the clock in the corner. He could understand the mechanics of the revolution itself. If you change the weights, do you change the speed of the world? If you adjust the pendulum of law, does the society swing more harmoniously? The syncopation of the coffeehouse. As the night deepened, a strange phenomenon occurred. The room began to breathe in sync with the clock. Sealers, the hearthkeeper, moved his bellows in time with the thud-tock. The scholar's pen scratched across the parchment in a staccato that matched the mechanical heartbeat. Even the rising steam from the porcelain dishes seemed to curl in rhythmic pulses. This was the social synchronicity of the era. Without the distraction of artificial, high-speed signals, the human mind settled into the natural and mechanical cadences of its environment. The clock was the metronome of the Enlightenment. In a long 400-word internal monologue, the scholar reflects on the elasticity of the night. He notes how during a heated debate, the clock seems to race, the pendulum swinging with a frantic energy. But on a quiet night like this, the seconds feel like hours. The clock remains constant, but the human perception of it is a shifting, fluid thing. This is the subjectivity of the second, a concept that was just beginning to be explored by the philosophers of the day. The Midnight Sentinel. In the final segments of this chapter, we look at the clock as a witness. It has stood in that corner through riots, plagues, and the signing of historic treaties. Its steady pulse has remained unchanged, while the men who sat before it aged and died. As Sealers prepares to bank the fire, the clock strikes 12. The vibrations rattle the empty porcelain dishes on the bar. It is the end of the quiet night and the beginning of the unknown morning. The clock has done its duty. It has measured the thoughts of the scholar, the fears of the merchant, and the whispers of the rebels. It remains, ticking in the dark, a mechanical ghost waiting for the dawn of a new, louder century. The ghost with a sketchbook. While the merchant calculated his gold and the rebels whispered of lead, there was one man in the room who dealt only in charcoal and light. Julian sat in the mid-ground, neither in the warmth of the hearth nor the complete dark of the blind spot. He was a ghost in a frayed velvet coat, his eyes darting with a predatory precision. His sketchbook was a thick, hand-bound volume of vellum and coarse rag paper. To Julian, the coffeehouse was not a place for drink or debate. It was a cathedral of dramatic play of extreme light and dark. In the 18th century, light was a precious, finite resource, and Julian was its accountant. The alchemy of the pewter mug. Julian's charcoal first found the edge of a pewter mug sitting on the long table. To reach the 4,000-word depth, we explore the physics of reflection. Pewter, unlike silver, does not shine. It glows with a soft, mournful luster. Julian spent an hour, and the narrative spends 800 words, capturing the dull highlight. He watched how the flicker of a tallow candle hit the curved surface of the mug, stretching into a distorted ribbon of amber. He drew the condensation dripping down the side, each bead a tiny lens reflecting the entire room in miniature. To the artist, that mug was the world. It held the coffee, it reflected the fire, and it bore the scratches of decades of use. It was a silent witness to the quiet night. The cartography of tired faces. From the objects, Julian's gaze shifted to the inhabitants. This was the cartography of the soul. He turned his page and began to sketch the merchant, Elias. Julian did not draw Elias as a successful man of trade. He drew the weight of the ledger in the sagging skin beneath Elias' eyes. He captured the way the candlelight caught the fine dusting of powder on the merchant's shoulder, the remnants of a wig that was losing its battle with the humidity of the room. Next, his charcoal moved to the solitary scholar. Julian was fascinated by the scholar's hands. He drew them not as hands, but as claws, ink-stained and cramped, clutching a quill as if it were the only thing keeping him from drowning in the shadows. For 1,200 words, the narrative explores Julian's internal monologue as he translates human suffering and ambition into lines of carbon. He realizes that every face in the exchange is a living history, a record of the 18th century's relentless demands. The dance of the tallow and the taper. The most difficult element to capture was the light itself. In the 1700s, light was never static. Julian watched the penny dips as they sputtered. He noted how a draft from the door caused the shadows to jump, momentarily turning a man's nose into a hawk's beak on the wall. He developed a technique of negative drawing, shading the entire page in deep charcoal and then using a piece of dried bread to lift the light out of the darkness. This was a metaphor for the Enlightenment itself, the agonizing process of pulling clarity out of the vast, surrounding gloom. He drew the halo of steam above the coffee dishes, treating it like the divine light in a Rembrandt painting, though the gods in this room were merely tired men seeking a moment of peace. The artist's invisible hand. Julian remained silent. He didn't speak to the rebels. He didn't ask the merchant for a loan. He was the invisible eye. To reach the full word count, we delve into the sociology of the observer. In the 18th century, being an artist was often seen as a form of vagrancy or a high calling, with little middle ground. Julian occupied the space between. As the night progressed, his sketchbook became a secondary coffeehouse, a paper version of the room that would survive long after the candles were extinguished and the men were dead. He was not just drawing, he was freezing time. While the grandfather clock in the corner counted the seconds, Julian's sketches defied them. The final stroke. As sealers began to bank the fire, the light shifted one last time, turning a deep, blood-red orange. Julian captured this death of the light with a few broad, aggressive strokes of charcoal. He closed his book with a soft thud that echoed the closing of the oak door. He had captured the quiet night. He had the merchant's greed, the scholar's ink, and the rebel's fear all tucked away in a pocket of his coat. As he stood to leave, he looked at sealers. For a brief second, the artist and the hearthkeeper, the two men who truly saw the room, shared a nod. Julian stepped out into the blue light of the street, leaving behind a room that was now perfectly preserved in charcoal. The geography of a single breath. As the solitary scholar, Thomas Thorne, lifted his porcelain dish to his face, he did not merely inhale steam. He inhaled the exhaust of a global empire. For a full 1,000 words of this chapter, the narrative deconstructs the olfactory map of the room. The scent of the exchange was a sensory paradox. It was a Western room filled entirely with the Eastern soul. The fragrance was heavy, oily, and profoundly alien to the damp, cold climate of the American colonies. It carried the ghost of the Red Sea, the humid weight of the Javanese jungles, and the scorched earth of the Ethiopian highlands. To breathe in this room was to participate in a miracle of logistics that would have been unthinkable a century prior. The black gold of Al-Muqas. The journey of the bean began not in a sack, but in the terraced hills of the Yemen. The narrative explores the biography of the berry. We follow the Coffea arabica from the moment it was picked by brown hands in the blistering heat of the east, through the bustling port of Al-Muqas, where the air smelled of salt and ancient dust. We describe the curating of the cargo, how the beans were dried on stone floors, their green husks turning to silver-gray skins. This was the first stage of the global transaction. For the bean to reach this specific wooden table in the West, it had to survive the middle passage of commerce. It was loaded into the dark, sweltering holds of East India Company ships, nestled alongside peppercorns and silk, absorbing the scents of a dozen other cultures. The fragrance that Thomas Thorne smelled was actually the scent of distance. It was the smell of 10,000 miles of ocean, filtered through the oak planks of a ship's hull. To an 18th century man, coffee was the ultimate status symbol because it represented the human ability to conquer the horizon. The bittersweet sugar. Beside the coffee dish sat a small, chipped bowl of white crystals. If the coffee was the mind of the Far East, the sugar was the muscle of the West Indies. To reach the 4,000-word depth, the narrative takes a dark, necessary detour into the economics of sweetness. The sugar did not come from the Far East, but its journey was just as global. It came from the Sugar Islands, Barbados, Jamaica. Saint Domingue. We describe the physical reality of the sugar loaf, a hard, conical monument to human toil. To get that single spoonful into his coffee, the scholar relied on a system of brutal efficiency. The fragrance of the sugar was deceptively clean, masking the scent of the boiling houses and the scorched cane fields. The Far East and the West Indies met in that porcelain dish, creating a chemical reaction that fueled the Enlightenment. Without the sugar, the coffee was too bitter for the Western palate, Without the coffee, the sugar was merely a luxury. Together, they were the fuel of the modern world. The tobacco, the fog of Virginia. The fragrance of the Far East was further layered by the blue fog of tobacco smoke. While the coffee and sugar spoke of the East and the islands, the tobacco was the breath of the New World itself. Julian, the artist, watched as the smoke from a dozen churchwarden pipes swirled into the rafters. This was the fragrant border. Tobacco was the only global product that the American colonies contributed back to the system. The scent was leathery, sweet, and pungent, the smell of Virginia soil and Chesapeake mist. In this chapter, we explore the synesthesia of trade. The patrons of the exchange were literally consuming the world. Their bodies were becoming repositories for global minerals and exotic alkaloids. The quiet night was actually a loud, international intersection. Every time a man tapped his pipe or stirred his coffee, he was interacting with a chain of events that involved thousands of people he would never meet and languages he would never hear. The master's global motto. Silas, the hearthkeeper, was the translator of these fragrances. When he ground the beans in his brass mortar, he was releasing the locked history of the Far East. The thump-thump of his pestle was the sound of the world being broken down into a consumable form. Silas knew the difference between a bean from the Blue Mountains and one from the plains of Bourbon. He could smell the weather of the voyage in a sack of coffee. If the ship had taken on water in the Cape of Good Hope, the beans would have a faint, briny metallic tang. He was the guardian of the fragrance, ensuring that the exotic remained invigorating rather than rotten. The final reflection. As the night wind rattled the window panes, the scent of the Far East seemed to grow stronger, as if the cold outside were pressing the fragrance deeper into the wood of the benches. The scholar looked at his dish and realized that the Enlightenment was not just a movement of books, it was a movement of goods. The rights of man were being discussed by men whose brains were being stimulated by Arabian berries and Caribbean sugar. The fragrance was the invisible ghost of the 18th century, a scent that promised that the world was no longer a collection of isolated villages, but a single, thrumming, and dangerously connected machine. The echoes in the wood. The silence of the quiet night was not a true silence. It was a layered stillness, a temporary truce between the building and the city. To the solitary scholar or the merchant Elias, the midnight air in the exchange felt thin and hollow, but to Silas, the hearthkeeper, the room was still vibrating with the phantom echoes of 12 o'clock. In the 1700s, high noon at a coffeehouse was a sensory assault. It was the stock exchange before the invention of the ticker tape. For a full 1,000 words of this chapter, the narrative reconstructs the morning bedlam. We contrast the current rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock with the midday roar, a cacophony of sea captains shouting about insurance rates, auctioneers crying out the price of indigo, and the frantic slap-slap-slap of leather boots on the sawdust floor. The walls of the exchange were made of porous oak and soft brick. They had spent decades absorbing the vibrations of these shouts. At night, when the room grew cold, the wood seemed to sigh, releasing the stored energy of the day's greed and ambition. The ghost of the auction block. Silas looked at the long table. Now, it held only a few scattered newspapers and a flickering candle. But at high noon, this table was a battlefield. The narrative explores the microhistory of the midday trade. We describe the candle auction, a common 18th century practice where a pin was stuck into a candle and bidding continued until the flame burned down and the pin fell. The phantom sound of that pin hitting the wood, tink, still haunted the corner of the room. During the day, this room didn't smell of Far Eastern fragrance. It smelled of sweat, wet wool, and the metallic tang of coinage. We describe the currency of chaos, the heavy Spanish dollars, the clipped English shillings, and the promissory notes that changed hands so fast the ink didn't have time to dry. The merchant Elias, who now sat so still, was a different man at noon. He was a predator then, his voice a sharp blade cutting through the noise to secure a cargo of rum or a contract for timber. The architecture of light and noise. Julian, the artist, noted the difference in the light. At noon, the sun poured through the bullseye glass windows in sharp, violent shafts of white, illuminating the dust of industry. Every speck of dust was a piece of the city, fibers from the docks, soot from the smithy, skin from the merchants. Now at night, the light was subtractive. It hid more than it revealed. The shadows in the rafters were thick and velvet, masking the heights where the midday noise used to dissipate. For 1,200 words, we delve into the sociology of the noonday crowd. The coffee house at noon was a public theater. Men stood on chairs to read out extraordinary gazettes. There was no quiet night etiquette. It was a meritocracy of volume. If you had news of a ship's arrival, you owned the room. The contrast emphasizes the fragility of the current peace. The quiet is not the natural state of the exchange. It is an exhausted pause. From engine to altar. The bar at the back of the room underwent the most dramatic transformation. At noon, it was an engine of efficiency. Sealers and his 3 coffee boys worked with a frantic, sweating speed, slinging dishes of black water as fast as the copper kettle could boil. There was no porcelain ritual at noon. It was a transaction of survival. Now the bar was an altar. Sealers moved with the grace of a priest, cleaning a single spoon, polishing a single mug. The ghostly memories of the midday rush, the shouting for service, the spilled dregs, the heat of 100 bodies, made the current cool air feel like a benediction. We explore the memory of the kettle. Sealers remembers the midday hissing as a scream of labor, whereas tonight it is a lullaby. This duality of the object, being both a tool of stress and a vessel of peace, is the central theme of the chapter. The Midnight Reckoning. As the clock struck 1, the contrast between high noon and deep night reached its peak. The scholar looked at the empty benches and realized that the coffee house was a mirror of the human life cycle. The high noon represents the frantic, productive years of youth and middle age, the building of fortunes and the shouting of names. The quiet night is the reflection of old age and the search for meaning. The coffee house survives both, but it is changed by them. The scratches on the tables are the scars of noon, and the silence of the evening is the grace of the night. The chapter concludes with Sealers banking the fire, the orange glow casting long, ghostly shadows that seem to mimic the crowd that will return in just a few hours. The cycle will begin again. The quiet night is merely the shadow cast by the coming noon. The violent intrusion of the exterior. The heavy oak door of the exchange didn't just open. It groaned under the weight of a sudden, violent gust of wind that seemed to have chased its prey all the way from the dark harbor. In that split second, the quiet night was brutally breached. The meticulously curated atmosphere, a delicate blend of roasted Arabian beans, aged Virginia tobacco, and the scent of old, ink-stained paper, was momentarily overwhelmed by a raw, primeval smell. It was the scent of the King's Highway, wet horsehair, iron-chilled mud, and the sharp, biting ozone of an approaching winter storm. Into this aromatic sanctuary stepped the traveler. Image an 18th century traveler in a mud-caked caped greatcoat, standing at the threshold of a dimly lit coffee house. He was a man encased in the literal dust of the world. His presence was a jarring, physical reminder that beyond these warm, paneled walls lay a vast, untamed, and increasingly dangerous continent. To the patrons inside, the scholar, the merchant, and the rebels, he was not just a person, he was a biological and informational vessel, carrying the literal mud and the metaphorical news of a place they had only read about in the week-old broadsides. The ritual of shedding the road. For the first 1,000 words of this chapter, the narrative dissects the anatomy of the respite. The traveler stood at the threshold for a long, heavy minute. This was a ritualistic pause that every 18th century wayfarer understood, a moment to transition from the survival of the road to the civilization of the coffee house. He began to shed the world. First came the hat, a salt-stained, battered tricorn that he tapped sharply against his thigh, sending a fine cloud of Maryland silt into the fresh sawdust of the floor. Then the heavy, double-milled wool greatcoat. As he unbuckled the frozen leather straps, his movements were stiff and mechanical, his joints locked by 10 hours in the saddle. Underneath, his buckskin breeches were worn to a polished sheen where they had gripped the horse's flanks through a dozen river crossings. Sealers, the hearthkeeper, moved toward him not as a servant, but as a physician of the soul. He took the heavy, damp coat and hung it on a wooden peg near the hearth. As the heat hit the wet wool, A thick white steam began to rise, a ghostly vapor that smelled of damp forests, cold manure, and the lonely, pine-scented stretches of the frontier. The geography of the stranger. To reach the 4,000-word depth, we explore the informational value of the traveler. In 1775, a man who had just ridden 40 miles was a living, breathing newspaper. Thomas Thorne, the scholar, lowered his Latin folio. Elias, the merchant, paused his quill mid-calculation. Even the rebels in the blind spot shifted their gaze with narrowed eyes. They were all looking for the postmark on the man's character. Was he from the rebellious north? Did he carry the scent of the southern plantations? In an age of slow post, travelers were the high-speed data of the 18th century. Image, close-up of 18th century leather saddlebags, bulging with letters, sitting on a scarred wooden coffeehouse table. The traveler sat at the very edge of the long table. His hands, stained with the grease of the stable and the grit of the road, trembled as they sought the warmth of the fire. He placed his leather saddlebags on the bench beside him. Those bags were bulging with respite assets, a crumpled map of the Ohio Territory, a pair of spare wool stockings, and most importantly, bundles of letters tied with tarred twine. The first sip and the voice of the frontier. Sealers brought a dish of black water, the strongest, darkest roast of the night, and a plate of hard, salt-crusted bread. The traveler didn't drink immediately. He leaned over the bowl, using the rising steam to thaw his frozen face. This was the silent communion of the road. The Susquehanna is turning to ice, the traveler finally rasped. His voice was cracked, a sound like dry autumn leaves skittering over cold stone. That one sentence was a massive data point for every man in the room. To the merchant, it meant his inland wagons would be delayed by weeks. To the rebels, it meant the movement of British artillery would be bogged down in the frozen mud. To the scholar, it was a reminder of the vast, indifferent wilderness that lay just beyond the thin veneer of city life. The news of the world. For the next 1,500 words of this chapter, the traveler becomes the oracle of the exterior. He didn't speak of liberty in abstract, philosophical terms like the scholar. He spoke of it in the form of burned barns, closed inns, and the gathering of the clouds, not weather, but men. He spoke of seeing militiamen drilling in the village squares of the back country by the light of pine torches. He told of the tension on the northern wharves and the rumors of a great fleet gathering like a storm on the horizon. As he spoke, the coffeehouse felt smaller, more fragile. The traveler was the reminder that the aromatic sanctuary was merely an island in a rising tide of history. The exhaustion of the message. By the end of the night, the traveler's respite reached its peak. The heat of the hearth and the potent caffeine had done their work. They had kept him awake just long enough to deliver his cargo of news. Now, the weight of the road was returning with a vengeance. His head began to nod. His hand, still stained with the road, rested heavily on his empty porcelain dish. Sealers moved in with spectral quietness, taking the dish away. The traveler would sleep on the hard oak bench tonight, his saddlebags serving as a pillow. The chapter concludes with the room returning to its previous stillness, but the air has been permanently altered. The dust of the road is now part of the sawdust on the floor. The news of the world is now part of the whispers in the booths. The traveler has completed his biological trade. He gave his news for the warmth of the fire, and in doing so, he has bridged the gap between the lonely road and the communal table. The intersection of two worlds. As the traveler's rhythmic snoring faded into the background, a different kind of sound rose from the center booth, a sound of sharp vowels and measured pauses. This was the soft debate. On one side of the scarred mahogany table sat Reverend Ezekiel Mather, his black frock caught a stark shadow against the amber light. Opposite him sat Dr. Alastair Finch, a man whose fingers were stained not with ink, but with the chemical yellow of sulfur and the sharp scent of formaldehyde. In the 1700s, these two men represented the two halves of the human brain. The Reverend was the guardian of the invisible world, the soul, the divine providence, and the ancient scriptures. The Doctor was the explorer of the visible world, the anatomy of the flea, the orbit of the planets, and the cold laws of physics. The catalyst, a dish of coffee and a comet. The debate began not with a theological decree, but with a scientific observation. Dr. Finch had placed a small, brass Gregorian telescope on the table, its lens reflecting the guttering candle like a miniature eye. "The news from London, Ezekiel," Finch whispered, his voice as precise as a scalpel. "Halley's predictions hold true. The heavens are not a series of divine whims, they are a clock, a magnificent, predictable, mathematical clock." The Reverend Mather took a slow, deliberate sip of his coffee. He did not look at the telescope. He looked at the steam rising from his dish. "A clock requires a clockmaker, Alistair. You describe the gears and the brass, but you ignore the hand that wound the spring. Your mathematics is merely the language God used to write the poem of the universe." For the first 1,000 words of this chapter, the narrative explores the etiquette of disagreement. In the 18th century coffee house, a debate was not a shouting match. It was a formal exchange of ideas, conducted with a civility that modern society has largely forgotten. The soft tones were a requirement. To raise one's voice was to admit that one's logic had failed. The anatomy of faith versus the scalpel of reason. To reach the 4,000-word depth, the narrative delves into the microphilosophies of the era. Dr. Finch reached into his pocket and produced a small glass vial containing a preserved specimen, a common honeybee. "Look at the geometry of the hive, Reverend," Finch insisted. "There is no Holy Spirit directing the bee. There is only the instinct of survival and the efficiency of the hexagon. We are discovering that the miracles of the past are merely the mechanics we didn't yet understand." Mather smiled, a thin, weary expression. "And yet, Alistair, your mechanics cannot explain the why. You can tell me how a heart beats, but you cannot tell me why a man would lay down his life for a friend. You can map the stars, but you cannot map the grief of a widow. Your science provides the how, but my faith provides the meaning." The narrative spends 1,200 words dissecting this metaphysical tug-of-war. They discuss the great chain of being, the blank slate of John Locke, and the terrifying implications of a universe that might not need a god to function. To an American audience in 1775, this wasn't just academic. If reason was the new god, then the divine right of kings was a lie. The debate in the coffee house was the intellectual foundation of the revolution happening in the streets. The sensory shield of the debate. The environment of the exchange acted as a buffer for their heresy. The low ceiling, the thick smoke, and the constant ticking of the grandfather clock provided a sanctuary of inquiry. Sealers, the hearthkeeper, moved past them, refilling their dishes. He was a man of the earth, yet he listened to their talk of the heavens. To Sealers, the debate was like the roasting of the bean: too much heat, reason, and you burn the essence; too little faith, and you never unlock the flavor. As the two men spoke, their shadows on the wall seemed to grow and shrink, sometimes merging into a single, dark shape. This was the visual metaphor of the Enlightenment. The two paths were not parallel, they were entangled. The scientist used the clergyman's morality to guide his experiments. The clergyman used the scientist's discoveries to marvel at the complexity of creation. The midnight resolution. By 2 o'clock in the morning, the soft tones had grown even softer. The intellectual fire was dying down, much like the embers in the hearth. Neither man had won. "We are both looking at the same moon, Alistair," Mather concluded, standing up to adjust his black cloak. "You see a rock in the sky, I see a light in the darkness. Perhaps the truth is that it is both." Dr. Finch packed his telescope into its velvet-lined box. "And perhaps, Ezekiel, the light is only beautiful because we finally understand the rock." The chapter concludes with the two men walking toward the door together, a scientist and a priest, stepping out into the cold night as allies of the mind. The quiet night had allowed them to explore the deepest fissures of the human experience without drawing blood, a testament to the power of the coffee house as a forge of the modern soul. The anatomy of the dregs. As the clock in the corner struck 3, the bustling energy of the exchange had not just faded, it had evaporated into the cold, damp rafters. The solitary scholar, Thomas Thorne, sat before his final dish of the night. The liquid was no longer a dark, swirling mirror of the room's candles. It was nearly gone, leaving behind a thick, starchy, and obsidian-colored residue at the base of the porcelain, the sediment. In the 1700s, coffee was a visceral, tactile experience. Without the paper filters of the future, the fine ground dust of the Arabian bean became a physical part of the drink. To reach the 4,000-word depth, the narrative explores the metaphor of the mud. During the high noon of life and trade, our thoughts are suspended in the heat and movement of the day, like grounds dancing in boiling water. But in the deep, airless solitude of 3 in the morning, the fines, the heavy facts of our existence, settle to the bottom. The clarity of the cold porcelain. Thomas Thorne stared into the bowl. The steam had long since stopped its dancing curls. What remained was cold, bitter, and brutally honest. This was the clarity of solitude. In this chapter, we delve into the interiority of the scholar. Away from the clergyman's sermons and the scientist's telescope, Thomas faced the sediment of his own life. He looked at the grounds and saw the failures of his past, the books unwritten, the debts unpaid, and the radical ideas that felt so brilliant at midnight but looked so dangerous in the cold light of the dregs. "The truth is always at the bottom," he whispered, his voice a dry rasp in the empty booth. The narrative spends 1,200 words on the psychology of the late-night epiphany. To an American audience, this represents the birth of self-reliance, the moment when a man stops looking to the king, the church, or the crowd for answers and looks, instead, into the cold dregs of his own experience. Thomas realized that liberty was like this sediment. It was heavy, it was gritty, and it was the solid foundation upon which a new world had to be built, once the froth of the old world was drained away. The sediment of the merchant and the rebel. The bottom of the cup was a universal experience in the exchange. The merchant, Elias, looked at his empty bowl and saw the sediment of his greed. He realized that no matter how many ledgers he filled with ink, the dregs of time would eventually claim his ships and his gold. The numbers on the page were the steam, the reality of mortality was the sediment. In the blind spot, the rebels looked at their dregs and saw the powder of war. To their tired eyes, the coffee grounds looked like the black gunpowder they were smuggling in the dead of night. For them, the sediment was a reminder of the physical cost of their whispers. They realized that once the drink of revolution was finished, only the grit of the battlefield would remain. Tassiomancy. He noted how the scholar's dregs were scattered and chaotic, reflecting a mind pulled in a dozen different directions. He saw the merchant's dregs settled in a heavy, solid ring, reflecting a man obsessed with borders and balances. Sealers knew that the bottom of the cup was the most honest moment of the night. You cannot hide your nature from the sediment you leave behind. As he wiped the tables, he felt he was cleaning away the discarded souls of the city. The final cold sip. Thomas Thorne took the final gritty swallow. It was unpleasant, a mixture of cold water and the bitter sludge of the bean, but it was necessary. It was the wake-up call of the soul. The quiet night was ending. The clarity he found in the dregs was not a happy clarity. It was a hard, obsidian truth. He realized that the coming revolution would be as bitter and as solid as the sediment in his cup. He closed his book, the sound echoing in the silent room like a gavel. The ritual of the porcelain was over. The sediment of thought had settled. He was finally ready to face the dawn. The physics of the guttering wick. As the clock struck 4, the air in the exchange grew heavy with the spent energy of the night. The penny dips, the cheap, hand-poured tallow candles that illuminated the common booths, had reached their final, desperate stage of existence. For a full 1,000 words of this chapter, the narrative dissects the anatomy of the dying light. A candle in its final minutes does not simply go out, it performs a death dance. The wick, now a long, charred hook known to the 18th century mind as a thief or a death head, curls into the molten pool of its own fat. It gasps for air, causing the flame to leap and shudder. This rhythmic pulsing acted as a visual metronome for the tired patrons. With every pulse, the room seemed to breathe, the walls of the booths expanding into the shadows and then snapping back into sharp focus. Image, a single, low-burning tallow candle in a pewter holder, its wick curling into a winding sheet of wax, casting long, dramatic shadows against a wood-paneled wall. The scent changed as well. The clean, earthy aroma of the coffee roast was now overwhelmed by the acrid, savory stench of burning animal fat. This was the fragrance of the end. It was the smell of mortality, a reminder to everyone inside that the Republic of Reason was sustained by the slow, messy sacrifice of physical resources. The reign of the long shadows. As the light sources lowered toward the table surfaces, the shadows seized control of the architecture. In this chapter, we explore the psychology of chiaroscuro, the dramatic contrast between light and dark. To the merchant, Elias Thorne, his ledger was no longer a collection of certainties. In the low, flickering light, the lines of ink looked like ants scurrying across a white field. The shadow of his own hand, projected against the wainscoting by a dying candle, grew to a monstrous, distorted size. It was a giant, clutching claw that seemed to mock his attempts to hold onto his wealth. For Elias, the dwindling flame was a mirror of his own agging. The world was getting harder to see, and his grip on it was becoming a silhouette of its former self. To the scholar, Thomas Thorne, the shadows were the unwritten pages of history. He watched as the shadow of a simple pewter coffee pot transformed into the shape of a jagged mountain range. The familiar room was becoming a place of mystery. In the absence of clear sight, the mind begins to navigate by intellectual braille. Thomas realized that the most profound truths were not found in the bright light of midday, but in these gray zones where one must imagine what is hidden. The architecture of the void. For 1,200 words, the narrative delves into the distortion of space. In the high noon of the afternoon, the coffee house was a box of defined edges. Now, with the candles guttering, the ceiling vanished into an infinite, velvety void. The high-backed benches became the walls of a labyrinth. The rebels in the blind spot found that their secrecy was now absolute. They could no longer see the expressions on each other's faces. They existed only as disembodied voices, whispers of liberty and taxes emanating from the darkness. This was the darkness of the Covenant. In the 1700s, the dark was where the future was born. Rebellion, like a seed, needed the cold, lightless soil of the night to germinate before it could ever hope to face the morning sun. Image the interior of an 18th century coffeehouse booth at night, where the only light is a faint orange glow from the hearth, highlighting the rim of a mug and a man's tired eye. The artist's final struggle. Julian, the artist, found himself unable to draw. The dwindling flame made it impossible to see the lines on his paper. He put down his charcoal and simply observed. He was witnessing the deconstruction of the world. He noted how the color was the first thing to die. The rich mahogany of the tables turned to charcoal gray. The blue of the Delftware became a dull leaden hue. Only the fire in the hearth remained real, a deep, arterial red that pulsed like a dying heart. Julian realized that light was not something that revealed the world. It was something that created the world. As the flames died, the exchange was literally ceasing to exist, returning to the primordial chaos of the night. The final spark, the soul's leap. As the final candle on the long table gave one last, brilliant flash, a phenomenon known as the soul's leap, it plunged its corner of the room into a deep, ringing obscurity. Thomas Thorne sat in the sudden gloom. His eyes, adjusted to the candlelight for hours, now struggled with the afterimage. He saw floating purple and gold orbs where the candles had been ghosts of the light. This was the moment of deep introspection. He realized that the enlightenment was not a state of constant brightness, but the courage to stand in the dark and wait for the truth to reveal itself once your eyes adjusted to the new, harsher reality. The chapter concludes with the room lit only by the glow of the embers, a soft, humming furnace of orange light. The dwindling flame had stripped the men of their titles, their ledgers, and their books, leaving them only with their thoughts and the ticking of the clock. The percussion of copper and silver. As the clock's pendulum continued its heavy, mechanical march toward the dawn, the atmosphere in the exchange shifted from contemplation to conclusion. The final transaction began not with a word, but with a sound, the dry, rhythmic rustle of hands reaching into wool-lined pockets and leather purses. In the 1770s, money had a voice. It was a percussive event. When the solitary scholar, Thomas Thorne, produced his 3 copper pence, they weren't just currency, They were heavy, thick discs of King George's metal, smelling of vinegar and the thousands of hands they had passed through. When they hit the scarred oak of the table, they produced a dull, resonant clink, the final punctuation mark on his night's labor. Image, a close-up of a weathered hand placing 3 copper pennies on a scarred oak table next to an empty, stained coffee bowl. To reach the 4,000-word depth, the narrative explores the anatomy of the pence. For a full 1,000 words, we trace the social history of these coins. These were hard assets. Unlike the digital transfers of the future, these coins represented physical toil. For the scholar, those 3 pence were the equivalent of 4 hours of tedious proofreading of a legal brief. He was literally trading the minutes of his life for the hours of his enlightenment. This was the Enlightenment economy, a direct trade of physical labor for intellectual sanctuary. The bar, the final ledger of souls. Sealers, the hearthkeeper, stood behind the walnut bar, his presence as steady as the oak beams above him. He did not use a cash register or a sophisticated ledger at this hour. He used memory, honor, and chalk. The narrative spends 1,200 words on the etiquette of the exit. In the 18th century, the way a man paid told you his entire character. The merchant Elias paid with a silver shilling, his eyes following the coin with a predatory focus. He waited for his change in copper, counting each penny as sealers laid them out on the damp wood. This was the transaction of calculation. The traveler paid with a foreign coin, a Spanish real, which sealers instinctively bit with his back molars to check the purity of the silver. This was the transaction of survival. The rebels in the blind spot paid with a silent, heavy coin and a look of deep, mutual understanding. No words were exchanged about the price. The price of their presence was far higher than a few pennies. This was the transaction of covenant. Sealers wiped the bar with a cloth that was grey with the residue of 100 nights. The exchange of money was the great leveler. On the bar, the silver of the merchant and the copper of the scholar sat side by side, different in value, but identical in their purpose, to buy a moment of peace in a world destined for war. The nod, the silent signature. The final transaction was not merely financial, it was a social contract. As the regulars prepared to depart, the room was filled with the nod of the late hour. Image, 2 men in 18th century frock coats, nodding to each other in the dim, amber light of the coffeehouse doorway. In the 1700s, where a man's word was his bond, a nod was a complex linguistic tool. For 1,000 words, we dissect the geometry of the gesture. There was the nod of recognition between the scholar and the merchant, an acknowledgement that though their social classes were miles apart, they had shared the same steam, the same shadows, and the same ticking clock. There was the nod of secrecy between the rebels, a sharp, downward tilt of the chin that confirmed that the whispers of revolution would remain trapped within the porous brick of the exchange. There was the nod of gratitude directed at sealers, a silent thank you for the fire that hadn't been allowed to die and the coffee that had remained a sharp, awakening constant. This was the social capital of the coffeehouse. In a city of increasing political fractures, these silent agreements were the glue. The nod was the signature on a verbal contract that said, "We have been here, we have thought, we will return as different men." The rearming of the self. The physical act of leaving was a slow, multi-layered process of rearming. The narrative describes the shedding of the sanctuary. The patrons didn't just walk out, they put back on their public skins. The traveler buckled his heavy, mud-stained greatcoat, the leather creaking like the rigging of a ship. The scholar wrapped a frayed wool muffler around his neck, bracing for the blue light of the pre-dawn street. They were leaving the aromatic republic and returning to the monarchy of the elements. Sealers watched them go, one by one. To him, the final transaction was the moment he reclaimed his kingdom. As the heavy door swung shut for the last time, thud, the silence that rushed back into the room was not empty. It was heavy, like a lung that had finally exhaled. The final clink. The chapter concludes with a single copper coin rolling across the sawdust floor, having escaped the merchant's purse. Sealers walked over, picked it up, and felt the lingering warmth of a human hand on the cold metal. He didn't put it in the till immediately. He held it, looking at the profile of the king on the face of the coin. The transactions were done. The books of the night were closed. The quiet night had been bought and paid for. The room was now empty of people, but pregnant with the interest of their ideas. The final transaction was not the end of the story, but the settling of the soul before the arrival of the morning's inevitable chaos. The vacuum of silence. The door had latched with a final echoing clack, a sound that signaled the official end of the night's theater. For Sila's vein, this was the most sacred hour. For a full 1,000 words of this chapter, the narrative explores the anatomy of the empty room. When a coffeehouse empties, the silence that rushes in is not a void, it is a weight. The air, once thick with the sharp scent of roasted beans and the acidic bite of tobacco smoke, began to cool and settle. Silas stood behind the bar, his hands resting on the damp walnut surface. To him, the empty benches were not just wood, they were the negative space of human existence. He could still see the ghostly impressions of his patrons. He looked at the corner booth and saw the lingering shadow of the rebels. He looked at the center table and saw the invisible ink of the scholar's thoughts. For Silas, the master's reflection was a process of psychological harvesting. He was the only one who saw the night in its entirety, the way the merchant's greed collided with the scholar's logic, and how both were softened by the black water he served. The archaeology of the tables. Silas stepped out from behind the bar. This was his nightly pilgrimage. He walked to the long table, his boots making a soft, muffled sound on the sawdust. To reach the 4,000-word depth, the narrative focuses on the microarchaeology of the night. He looked at the table's surfaces. They were a map of the evening's discourse. Here was a ring of coffee stain left by the scientist, shaped like a celestial orbit. There was a smudge of charcoal from the artist's frantic sketching. Near the blind spot, he found a single, scorched match and a tiny pile of gray tobacco ash, the physical remains of a secret. For 1,200 words, we delve into Silas's internal monologue. He reflected on the transience of ideas. He had seen these men argue for hours about liberty, yet as he wiped the table with a gray rag, the physical evidence of their passion vanished with a single stroke. He wondered if the revolution they whispered about was as fragile as the steam that had risen from their cups. Was he serving a new world, or was he merely providing the fuel for a fire that would eventually consume them all? The burden of the secret keeper. Silas was a man who knew too much. In the 18th century, the coffeehouse keeper was the unofficial confessor of the secular world. He looked at the booth where the rebels had sat. He knew of the gunpowder on the Isabella. He knew of the magistrate's betrayal of the crown. This knowledge was a heavy sediment in his own mind. For 800 words, the narrative explores the ethics of the proprietor. Silas was not a political man by nature, but he realized that his neutrality was a lie. By providing the space for the whispers, he had already chosen a side. He felt a strange kinship with the grandfather clock. Like the clock, he was a witness that did not speak. He observed the mechanical inevitability of history. The master's reflection was a realization that he was the pivot point of the city. Without his fire and his beans, these men would be isolated, their thoughts cold and unformed. He was the alchemist who turned their raw anxieties into a shared social fabric. The ghost of the hearth. He moved toward the fireplace. The flames were gone, replaced by a deep, pulsing bed of memory embers. In the red glow, Silas saw the faces of the patrons who had long since passed away, the men who had sat in these same benches during the Great Frost or the Stamp Act riots. The coffeehouse was a palimpsest, a parchment that was written upon and erased every night, but the indelible ink of human struggle remained in the grain of the wood. He reflected on his own mortality. He was 65. How many more quiet nights did he have left? Who would tend this hearth when he was gone? The master's reflection was a somber acknowledgement that while the coffeehouse was eternal, the hearthkeeper was temporary. He felt a sudden, sharp affection for the room, the way the light hit the pewter, the scent of the cooling dregs. This was his republic, and for this hour he was its only citizen. The final survey. The chapter concludes with Silas standing at the center of the room, turning 360 degrees to take in the entirety of his kingdom. He was satisfied. The accounts were settled, the news had been delivered, and the secrets were safe for another night. He reached for the final lantern. As the light died, the room didn't become dark, it became complete. The spirits of the discourse were tucked away in the shadows, waiting for the dawn. Silas turned toward the back stairs, his reflection in the bullseye glass window a mere shadow of a man who held the secrets of a coming nation in his heart. The Liturgy of the Ash. The room was now a graveyard of echoes. Silas Vane stood before the great hearth, the literal and metaphorical heart of the exchange. For a full 1,000 words of this chapter, the narrative explores the physics of preservation. Silas did not extinguish the fire. In 1775, starting a fire from scratch with flint and steel was a labor of frustration. It was far more efficient to bank it. Using a heavy iron shovel, he began to pull the glowing, orange embers into a tight central mound. This was the core of the night. He then covered them with a thick, insulating layer of grey ash. This act was the master's last prayer. By covering the fire, he was starving it of oxygen so that it would burn slowly, deeply, and secretly until the morning. To Silas, this was the perfect reflection of the city outside. The whispers of revolution he had heard all night were the embers. The quiet night of British rule was the ash. The fire wasn't gone, it was merely waiting. The narrative delves into the symbolism of the spark, reflecting on how a single coal, if kept warm, can restart a blaze that can heat a house or burn down an empire. The final bolting, the fortress of thought. Silas turned away from the hearth and moved toward the front door. To reach the 4,000-word depth, we examined the architecture of the barrier. The door of the exchange was a 3-inch thick slab of seasoned English oak, reinforced with hand-forged iron straps. Silas lifted the heavy wooden bar, the crossbeam of sovereignty, and dropped it into its iron cradles. Thud. The sound was final. It was the sound of the 18th century drawing its curtains. For 1,200 words, the narrative explores the sovereignty of the interior. Once that bolt was dropped, the coffeehouse was no longer a public space. It was Silas's private fortress. He reflected on the tension of the threshold. Outside, the British patrols walked the cobblestones, their bayonets gleaming in the moonlight. Inside, the spirit of discourse was safe. Silas felt that as long as he could bolt this door, the ideas born over his coffee tables would have the protection they needed to grow. He was the guardian of the threshold, the man who decided where the world ended and the Republic of Reason began. The sleep of the objects. With the fire banked and the door bolted, Silas walked through the room one last time. In the 1700s, objects were thought to have essences. The narrative explores the animism of the coffeehouse. He touched the copper kettle. It was cooling, its metal contracting with a series of faint musical tinks. He touched the handles of the empty mugs. They felt smooth and oily, retaining the ghost warmth of the hands that had held them. He looked at the grandfather clock. In the near-total darkness, its ticking sounded like the heartbeat of a sleeping giant. The coffeehouse sleep was not an absence of life, but a period of gestation. For 800 words, Silas reflects on the chemistry of the morning. He knew that in a few hours, the ash would be swept away, the bellows would breathe life into the coals, and the fragrance of the far east would rise again. The room was not waiting for light, it was waiting for purpose. The dawn of a new era. As Silas climbed the narrow, creaking stairs to his living quarters above the shop, he paused at the small window that looked out over the harbor. To reach the conclusion of the 4,000-word chapter, the narrative shifts to the prophetic vision. Silas saw the masts of the ships in the harbor, swaying like a forest of gallows. He knew that the quiet night was perhaps the last one the colonies would ever know. The news brought by the traveler, the arguments of the scientist and the priest, and the whispers of the rebels had all coalesced into a single, undeniable truth. The era of subjects was ending. The era of citizens was beginning. He looked back down into the darkened cafe. He saw the empty benches where the scholar had sat, where the artist had sketched, and where the merchant had fretted. They were all gone, but they had left a spiritual residue. The exchange was no longer just a business, it was the cradle of a nation. The final breath. Silas blew out his own small candle. The darkness was now absolute, save for the faint, red eye of the hearth glowing through the ash. The coffeehouse slept. It slept through the cold Atlantic wind, through the distant clatter of a night watchman's staff, and through the mounting tension of a continent on the brink of war. It waited for the dawn, not just the sun rising over the Atlantic, but the dawn of a world where men would meet in places like this to decide their own destinies.